Now, schools have been closed for quite some time now, and at this point, we really don't know exactly when our children will be able to physically return to their classrooms and be with their teachers and their peers. And while schools are closed, everything is being done remotely and online, just like what we're doing over here. And it's not that easy, and it's not the same for many out there. But when we talk about children with disabilities who are receiving special education, it's a whole different picture with a whole lot of challenges added to that. So Jill, let's first talk about special education. I know that every school district is different, of course, but how are the schools doing this? How are they offering education and even therapy services for children with disabilities? And what are some of the challenges that they're facing?
Every child with a disability who has an IEP still has a right to receive all of their IEP services during school closures caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think many of the barriers that every child is facing right now, the technology barrier, figuring out how to distance learn, finding a quiet space in a home to actually be able to pay attention to what's going on a computer or a tablet screen. But on top of that, children with disabilities are sometimes not being offered the services that they are entitled to from their school district. So that if those services are being offered, they're also kind of difficult to access and they're not as effective in a distance learning environment as they would be if a child was with an adult provider in a school or in a classroom.
The schools, are they actually offering all of these therapy services as well as classroom activities online as well for children with disabilities?
And every school district is doing things a little bit differently. We have some school districts that really aren't offering any services at all, and other school districts are working really hard to offer all of their services. And you've got kind of everything in between. That makes it very difficult for parents, especially parents where English is not their first language, to be able to work effectively with a school district and advocate for their child to make sure their child is getting the most services that are available. I do want to reiterate that kids actually have a right to receive all of their IEP services right now. District to reach out to request an IEP meeting to sit down and talk about what the child has a right to, what the child and the family can realistically do within the home setting in terms of hours a day or finding that quiet environment or the parent having to be there with the child to support them, paying attention. And to try to negotiate what is a realistic amount of services that they could receive at this moment.
If the parents do request an IEP meeting, is there a certain number of days that the school would have to get back to you on that?
So if parents request an IEP meeting, a school district legally has to hold that meeting within 30 calendar days. And those days really only count while there's a typical school year going on. And I would say, even though we're in distance learning, those days count right now. But when schools, the last day of school officially for many districts is kind of the end of May or the beginning of June. Once that end of the normal school year happens and before summer school starts, the days would not count.
When you think about IEPs, I think it's already a very intimidating and overwhelming process. But on top of that, if you have language barriers or you just have a whole bunch of stress that's going on just because of everything that's going on these days, it could be very stressful and even difficult for parents to even approach that process. Do you have any tips or advice that you can give to parents? Because I think that a lot of parents, they think that when they go into an IEP meeting, they're fighting and they have to prove to the school district why they need more help.
We have to acknowledge the reality that families and children are under increased stress and trauma right now from, housing or food instability, issues with their parents' employment or unemployment. And, on top of all that, you can add in language barriers. And so families are definitely struggling right now. Some of the good things about special education law and protections is that parents have a right to have their IEP meetings translated into their primary mode of communication or their first language. And so that is an absolute right that parents have to make sure that they can meaningfully participate in the IEP development process. And those rights are actually protected by federal and state law. Parents should feel confident in the fact that they know their children better than anyone else, and they know what their children's needs are during this very difficult time better than anyone else. And they can take that knowledge and that confidence into the IEP meeting and advocate for what their children need. There's a variety of nonprofit legal organizations, including my own, that provide free or low cost advocacy, including either advocates or attorneys that will go with families to their IEP meetings and advocate on their behalf. If you are not in the foster care system, please do check out these other agencies. One is called Public Counsel. Another one is called Learning Rights Law Center. And then there's also Disability Rights California, all amazing nonprofits that provide services at either no cost or very low cost to children and families suffering from disabilities.
Let's take a quick break on the IEP issues and special education issues, and let's talk about these language barriers, because these children in general education and all over, a whole bunch of children may have difficulties with languages as well as their parents. And usually when kids are at school, they get those support services. And when they're at school, parents have less of a burden. But now that everyone's at home, the parents have become homeschooling teachers. What are the challenges of distance learning for children and parents with these language barriers in these different communities?
Is that it's very complex. And the reason that it's so complex is because the language accessibility for different resources really fluctuates between languages and local districts. It really is depending on the relationship that a local district has with their community that they serve that really does impact in language resource services. But overall, one of the trends that we're seeing is one, just really lack of information and support for what we call limited English proficient parents when it comes to education information coming home in translation of how do they engage their students homeschooling. Yes, there is state and federal law that protects when it means to have in language services available and translation available for parents, but it really is very limited, and it's kind of like the gold standard, but it's not very implementable. That is, a school and a district has the obligation to provide in-service, in-language services and notification if a language meets a 15% benchmark. So if we have a language that doesn't meet that 15% benchmark, it's not, the schools and the district are not obligated to provide notification to parents in their language. Especially at Asian American communities, that issue is just so huge for us because there's so many different languages that are covered under Asian versus Latinx community that the majority of them fall under Spanish. So we'll have a lot of parents that are trying to engage with their children's education, not being able to have access to one, even basic information in their language they're needed. And the other issue is that this is turning into a pressure point for children in the homes to become the interpreters. Parents do have rights when it comes to having access to translated documents. So even if a school does not provide resources in your language because your language does not meet that benchmark, you can still request a translator to meet with you when you're meeting with your child and an issue comes out when you're having those IEPs and all of those things. So we're seeing that there's just so many gaps when it comes to that, but some districts are doing a great job when it comes to Spanish translation and Spanish documents being shared. We're just seeing that across the state, our biggest challenge has been in getting districts to really understand the needs of limited English proficiency API parents.
What if some schools, they happen to not offer in language support? And also, even if they do, I'm thinking that a lot of parents, if they have this language barrier, it's not like they have like one question a day and just part of the day. They may have, constant questions, but they probably, I don't know, I don't think it would be that easy for them to pick up the phone and call the school every single time. Are there any other resources for them to go to?
Latinx communities, it's very simple. Most districts have amazing faculty and administration in-house that can support. For API parents, Asian Pacific Islander parents, one of the biggest things that we ask them to do is actually make really good partnership with your local CBOs, which are your community-based organizations. And one of the things that we found is that it's not only with API families, it's not just the language barrier, but it's also the cultural barrier. In other countries, the relationship between parents and public education system is very different from Westernized American version. So a lot of CBOs and community organizations not only can help bridge that language barrier, but also that cultural barrier in order to make sure that parents are getting the support that they need in connection to the school districts or their schools, but also the resources that they need culturally to address educational issues they're facing in their families.
Yes, I can definitely see it because of that cultural barrier. A lot of people may think that it's too much of a burden that they're giving to these schools, and they may hesitate and just ask their child to translate or not even do things. I think that a lot of parents, because it's so stressful what's going on right now, that they just may end up just kind of giving up and just kind of seeing how things roll. But it also is a concern because you don't want that to affect their education and widen that gap with these children. Okay, so we've talked about all of these challenges. It sounds like there are many. So there are resources, but if these types of challenges continue, what are some of the long-term effects on our children's education?
When families are going through losing their housing, having food instability, are losing work and are being unemployed, all of those are traumas that really seriously impact families and really seriously impact children. And so I think that in addition to kind of the lesser amount of education that is going on through distance learning, that the equity gaps that are going on right now for children in the state of California in kind of all of our kind of non-majority groups. So children with disabilities, children who are English language learners, low-income children, homeless children, foster children, children in the juvenile justice system. All of those kids right now have a huge gap between how they are doing compared to our typical student population. I think that we know that those gaps are going to widen and increase.
Especially for English learners, phases in transition between academic stages is so important, right? So this disruption is huge for English learners through that transitional process. And we already deal with like the summer melt, right? There's like so much research of how much education we lose in the summer alone if students are not continuously engaged by parents or in summer programs. And so that stretching that out, we don't know the long-term impact that that's going to have in just education success and opportunities going forward. But so especially for API parents, that's something that continuously comes up, is that they don't feel welcomed or understood or served by a public education system. And so currently this practice and just this kind of reaffirmation almost in their head that they're not a priority for education systems and their schools can really be detrimental to the continuous relationship between these communities and the school systems. And, we say this a lot at the state level. There is a broken trust between immigrant API families and limited English proficiency families and public education system that we haven't seen before. And so that's one of the things that we're even more worried about, is just that continuous feeling of isolation and not being welcomed in schools, or not being a priority. Also, their children not being a priority through these sort of really hard times.
We are definitely concerned with for kids with special education needs who are not receiving their IEP related services right now. We think it's really important that districts be convening those distance learning IEPs to negotiate with families what services a child needs. And when schools hopefully reopen sometime in the fall, kids, we think, are going to be owed a lot of makeup services or compensatory services. And so the Alliance, along with a variety of amazing disability rights advocates, including the ACLU of Southern California and Disability Rights California, wrote a letter to the governor with some specific recommendations around making sure that children with special education needs are not kind of left behind during these physical school closures.
When you think about the compensatory services, because the children who are receiving therapies right now, most likely because everything's online, they're probably, say, if a child was receiving 1 hour of therapy, of speech therapy a week, that child may be, getting 15-20 minutes now. So are you saying that it's possible that these children will be able to get that makeup time after school starts?
Both the federal government and the State Department of Education have put out guidance saying that children may be eligible for those services. In a typical universe, if a district is not providing a child's required IEP services, they definitely have a right to those compensatory services. But now that you're talking about every disabled kid everywhere in the entire United States, the guidance is that they may be eligible for those services. There is no clear kind of process for how to request those services, how to prove your child needs those services, whether or not a family will have to prove that a child regressed by not receiving the services, and how would a family prove that with no school records. All of those questions are really up in the air and are going to be complicated issues that are going to have to be worked out kind of when we get into that school reopening phase. As advocates, we really hope and think that kids absolutely need those services, but the process to fight to get them is potentially going to be a difficult one.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot that needs to be considered here, and hopefully there will be some measures that will be taken by the school districts that can help our children just get back on track and not fall too much behind.
Typically, in order to receive special education services, a child does have to attend a public school, and those would include any school run by a school district and any charter school. That, families can seek a very limited amount of special education support services if the parent is kind of privately schooling the child at home or at a religious school. That is called an individual service plan, and the right to receive those special ed services in a private or a homeschool environment is much, much, much less. Being said, our public school system is not designed to it is not designed from an equity perspective. So it is not created to kind of lift up those hardest to reach students. And it is designed to educate kind of our top performers. What that means is kids with disabilities, kids who are learning English, those kids struggle really significantly. I think kids with disabilities and English learners are often also subject to sometimes really intense bullying and are not being protected by school officials. So there are lots of really relevant, important reasons why parents could choose to homeschool their children. And, again, a parent has to make the best decisions for their child and knows their child better than anybody else.
Yes, so direct services from district or state are really tied to being part of those systems, as Jill mentioned. So that is a huge limitation. On the CBO side, we're not tied to those things. So when it comes to being able to reach out to your local, organization, or asking for support from them, it again depends on the organization, depends on the language, and depends kind of the structure of the organization. But we are not tied to which system of education a parent employs in order to provide services. There might be services that organization provides that are tied to very specific systems, but overall information on stuff like that, we're not tied to that. As we are not part of the education system, we're outside advocates.
What I know is that if a child or an adult is eligible for those services from the regional center, they can request what's called respite services. And respite services are offered, a certain number of hours a week or a month. And those can be used by parents, if you have a really disabled child and need to go to the grocery store, for example. It is either a provider or money that you can use to pay for a babysitter. Parents often, especially if they're home all day caring for really disabled kids, may just need a break. Maybe they don't even need to run an errand. They just need to go outside for a little bit of time. That's kind of what respite is for, is to give those caregivers of really disabled children and adults just kind of a
Wow,
break.
because especially with this financial burden, with everything that's going on, a lot of people lost their jobs or cutting down on hours. So I think that services like that is definitely something that you should ask about.
Hence, advocacy starts with CBOs, organizations, and ethnic media. And I think that that's because we know that culturally there's a lot of gaps and a lot of doors that we need to go through to get parents feeling empowered and informed regarding their rights. And so what is the responsibility of media to partner up with local organizations to get that information out so we can start building those ideas and that rhetoric and that narrative in our communities, and then really engage parents in around what are their rights and how do you exercise them, because a lot of times I feel that parents don't even know that they have rights. So I really do think that there is a space for ethnic media to inform and build that narrative and share that information, and there is responsibility on community organizations for us to be able to come out as advocates as well in partnership with parents.
It is really important that we, have these types of meetings with the ethnic media, because there's so much information out there, and a lot of times people don't really do as much outreach as you would hope for in the ethnic communities. And the media is a great way to reach these people, because a lot of these community members, they rely on their own news in their own language. So that's one of the reasons why I try to do as many of these as possible. Yeah, so thank you all. I'll continue to host these types of ethnic media roundtables on COVID-19 related issues for now, and just keep on attending and help us share all this information to all of our ethnic communities.